if you like President Obama's politics, if you think that his politics are good, you probably like his voice. But if you don't like his politics, you probably notice that he has very big ears. And so that's the way it works.
Hello, 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 onbookers. This is Chris here. That up front was Daniel Kahneman, and he was speaking on research that was published in his 2011 book, Thinking Fast and Slow. The book summarizes over 2 decades of work with his research partner, Amos Tversky. In their work, they look at questions of judgment and decision-making that affect everything from playing the stock market to planning a vacation to questions of, will I be happier choosing choice A or choice B? The book is divided into 38 chapters, each run about 10 pages long, each chapter sharing a memorable story and some very clear ways that you can apply these findings to your life. And now, get ready for this. This book is so dense and so amazing that you and we are going to look at it in 2 parts. That means that this is the first in a 2-part breakdown of this book. So what to expect in this episode? First, I will read from 3 of the chapters on cognitive biases. So I'll give you some takeaways of times when you can trust your intuition and some tools for making yourself more aware of when not to trust your intuition. We'll talk briefly about something called System 1 versus System 2 thinking in this episode. And then the next episode will be almost entirely devoted to that, because I think once we have some good examples in this episode, that's going to become a lot more clear. So cognitive bias is this episode, System 1 and 2 thinking next episode, and as a next episode will also have to do with understanding happiness. So we'll get to that as well. In both episodes, I have a special guest. The wonderful Alex Miles Younger will be joining us. He is an amazing human being and can retell stories from this book with acuity, whatever that means. But it feels good. That's the point. He would have said that. It would have sounded so much better. And that's why I have him on here to help me explain this book. We've both read it. We are both ready to go through and bring it to you. And I'm excited, so you better be too. Let's get our book on. Let's do it. So to kick this off, I'm going to read to you some of the cognitive biases, specifically 3 cognitive biases. What is a cognitive bias? Well, in short, it's any time that a situation or a person, something in the environment, something causes you to make illogical choices. By recognizing these, you can make better choices. And that's pretty much what the whole book's about. Before I dive too deep, I need to define 2 words which come up again and again and again and again in the book. So I'm briefly going to define them now, System 1 and System 2 thinking. Ready? System 1 thinking is if I say, hey, bread and maybe you said butter, right? Or if I said 2 + 2 equals, you likely thought 4. System 1 thinking is the fast thinking in the book. It's the quick, it's just your intuition, it's your reaction. System 2, on the other hand, is the slow. Quick, calculate 17 by 24. What's the answer? Right? You don't know. It takes a second. Maybe in your brain, you're starting to think, okay, if I carry the 1, that kind of slow processing that takes effort, that's System 2 thinking. So that's all you need to know for now. We'll go into that in much more detail in the second part of this podcast episode, deconstructing the book. But for now, System 1 is fast. It's your intuition. It's your got it. System 2 is the, let me think about that. So if you got that, you'll be good when I read from the book. All right, here we go. Alrighty, so the first cognitive bias that I'm going to read to you about is called the lazy controller. And it's a 6 or 7 page chapter. It's not too long. And I'm going to read from you about the busy and depleted system 2, right? So that's slow thinking, when you have to calculate things, what that's like. So here we go. People who are cognitively busy are also more likely to make selfish choices, use sexist language, and make superficial judgments in social situations. Memorizing and repeating digits loosens the hold of System 2 on behavior. But, of course, cognitive load is not the only cause of weakened self-control. A few drinks have the same effect, as does a sleepless night. The self-control of morning people is impaired at night. The reverse is true of night people. Too much concern about how well one is doing in a task sometimes disrupts performance by loading short-term memory with pointless, anxious thoughts. The conclusion is straightforward. Self-control requires attention and effort. Another way of saying this is that controlling thoughts and behaviors is one of the tasks that System 2 performs. All right, so that's just a taste of this idea of how System 2 gets cognitively busy. When you're thinking, like I was saying before, it's 17 times 24. When your mind is hard at work thinking of things, or if you're thinking about all the things in your day and all the things you have to do, when your mind's full, Kahneman is saying, when your mind is full, your System 1 thinking, your kind of quick reacting to the world is at jeopardy. So in this case, if you're walking down the streets of New York, for example, and you're also typing on your phone and you're calculating and your mind's racing, you're much more likely to walk by someone who asks you for help, or to hold the door for somebody, or to do these kind of reactively polite things, because it's literally draining energy from you. Can you think of any times in your life right now, or today, let's say today, when maybe you felt cognitively loaded, your mind was racing? Maybe you were meditating. That's when it all comes out, right? It's good to start to notice those moments. I found this really helpful in my life, to just try and notice when my mind is racing. And to be honest, that is when something like meditation or just like smoking a cigarette. No, I'm just kidding. Just like sitting down. Don't do that. It was a joke. But just like chilling out, right? I mean, everybody has their own way of doing it. And in the book, he's talking about, having a few drinks or something like that can kind of loosen that hold. But the idea is that you want to find a way to control these thoughts. You want to find a way to make space so that you can consciously and deliberately make better decisions. And again, this is a term called being cognitively busy. If you fill your mind up too much with too many things to think about, you're bound to make poorer choices. That's lesson number 1. The second cognitive bias that I want to share with you is something known as cognitive ease, and this is chapter 5. The idea behind cognitive ease is that if something is more familiar to you, you're more likely to trust it, even though maybe you shouldn't be trusting it. So he writes, familiarity is not easily distinguished from the truth. With cognitive ease, there's a range between easy, all the way on the left, something that's easy to understand, and something all the way on the right, which is hard to understand, and he calls that cognitive strain. If you have to strain to think too much, like, do I know this person? Or is that really true? You're likely to just stop thinking about it and just go, it's probably not true. While on the other hand, if something does seem familiar, you're more likely to just go, oh, yeah, okay, whatever, and just go about your day and perhaps believe it without putting too much thought into it. There are a few different tests that Kahneman and Amos, that they put to the test to research this. I'm going to share with you one right now. This brings up the truth illusion, so that's part of the cognitive ease, and that there's an illusion of truth. The general principle is that anything that you can do to reduce the cognitive strain and maximize legibility will help people believe you more. So they gave a bunch of people these 2 facts. They said they were facts. They said, I'm going to read them to you right now. Adolf Hitler was born in 1892, and the other one is Adolf Hitler was born in 1887. So which of the 2 is true? They asked. Now, what you can't see, because I'm looking at the book and you're not, but I'll tell you, is that the first one's written very legibly, while the second one is a bit harder to understand. The first one's bold and very clear, and the second one's a little bit lighter and below it. So their point is that, so first off, neither of those are true. So they were lying, which is fine. But neither of those are true. But experiments have shown that the first is more likely to be believed. So their advice is that if your message is printed, use high quality paper to maximize the contrast between characters in the background. If you use color, you are more likely to be believed if your text is printed in bright blue or red than using different shades of green or yellow or ugly colors. So if you care about being thoughtful, credible, intelligent, Kahneman writes, do not use complex language or simple language will do. That's the whole point of what this cognitive is about. If you make it simple, if you make it clear and more legible and familiar, people will believe you. I sometimes think about this in the way that famous people must live their lives as being more truthful seemingly more truthful than someone who isn't famous, right? And I think, and that comes up in my talk with Alex that you're going to hear in a bit, that comes up with celebrity endorsements, right? It's like Kanye West eats SpaghettiOs. Oh, I guess they're really good. They must maybe even be good for you since he's such a smart person. I don't know. You heard it here first. Kanye West eats SpaghettiOs. Next time you think of SpaghettiOs, you might think of Kanye West. You might want to have those. That's the point this is. And I try to think sometimes, this is kind of weird, but I kind of think like walking through New York City, like maybe the more time that I spend walking through the city and people just see my face, then when I maybe meet that person somewhere down the line, they'll have more familiarity with me and trust me. Maybe I should put billboards around the city to make people trust me. Although the Pope did that, and it was kind of weird. I don't know. You get the point. Okay. Next cognitive bias. The third and final, this is 3 of 3, cognitive biases that I am going to share with you is in the chapter A Machine for Jumping to Conclusions, and this one is known as the halo effect. Quite simply, the halo effect is this idea that if you like someone, then you tend to like everything about that person. And if you dislike someone, then maybe you don't expect them to be so nice or something like that. So that was what came up early, right when this episode started, with Kahneman speaking about Obama. If you like Obama, you tend to say, hey, he's just pretty good. I like his voice. But if you don't like him, then you find other things wrong with him. And we do this all the time with the people around us, with our friends, interviewing especially. If a friend is recommended to you, hey, you should talk to this person and interview them for your company, they're already coming with biases because you have a connection to them. So all Kahneman is asking is that you recognize these biases and that you just kind of put it aside in your brain and truly try to see things for how they are and say, hey, in this case, I am using the halo effect. An example of when you can use this term, imagine you're going to a meeting or you're going to a presentation and the person is such a fantastic presenter and you're blown away. You're like, this is a great talk that you're giving. You're so charismatic. You may leave that thinking, yeah, I really agree with that person's, take on this. And then, but if you can deconstruct it and notice the halo effect, maybe you'll say, well, actually, let's break down the actual facts that were talked about in this, right? If you pull that out and you can see beyond the charisma, you can notice that the halo effect, that ability of that person to be charismatic, may have also led you to believe other good things about them. And the same thing goes for a poor presenter. This reminds me of the famous Nixon-Kennedy debate when they were first on TV back in the 60s. And Nixon, obviously, he didn't look so great on television. And because of that, they believe or speculate that that's especially why he lost the debate, because the people on the radio that listened to the debate who couldn't see Kennedy's good looks, they thought that Nixon won the debate. But everybody who watched the TV, who got to see them, they had the halo effect. They saw that, hey, this guy's so good looking, this Kennedy. Everything he's saying must be spectacular. So that's the halo effect. I think you're going to start to notice it immediately, starting now. Let us jump now to my conversation with Alex Miles Younger. He is the creative director for Seth Godin. He dropped by the studio here to chat about this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and we started off the conversation just chatting about how each of us heard about this book in the first place. And that's where we're going to take it from. He was mentioning that at work, he was looking for ways to learn more about how to make better decisions and how to give advice to the team that he was running. So let's take it from there. All right, here you go.
I was coming up against this shortcoming where I was like, well, I know how I would do it, but I can't just do it for them, and I can't tell them what to do.
Yeah.
And so I was having this conversation about how, I wish there was a way to like give better advice is kind of where this came from. And, Tav and I were talking about, product management and decision making and all these other things. And he was like, you know what? You just want to read this book. This is sort of the tome that is going to knock it out of the park for how you make decisions. And what I think was interesting here, for anybody who hasn't read this, is that Kahneman sets the book up and he says right in the intro, I don't think I can teach you how to make better decisions. And I was like, well, what am I reading this book? Yeah, exactly. But what he aims to do is make you better at understanding and critiquing other people's decisions.
Oh, okay.
So like you're hanging out at the proverbial water cooler at your office and you're talking about something that's happened. You have a much more informed language after reading this book for talking about, that thing which we just did, they chose that guy for the marketing position, but I think they chose him because like he's really tall and he's super handsome and he's got those great square glasses and that beard is so full. I know.
Hey.
But I think what was happening was there was a halo effect because we saw how pretty he was, but we don't know that actually informed how skilled he was as a marketer. And so at the end of each chapter too, they have these little like dialogues sort of like that where it explains like, here's a cognitive trap. This is what that person probably did. And Kahneman says it is so much easier to start to recognize this in other people than it is to like start to like modify your own behavior. And certainly there's a lot to talk about in here about like why we're not quite as in control of our own thinking as we assume that we are. But I thought that was such an interesting frame to start with. And while I was initially skeptical, it starts to make sense to me that if you create a culture in your office, in your family, in your friend group, wherever, your church, your whatever your core community is that like you want it to do better things, if everyone gets better at saying, hey, you're doing this thing, I can see from the outside you're doing this, and you've already got the shared language and you know what they mean when they say like, oh, I think you're being, you've got some confirmation bias going on. You're like, oh, okay, I think you're right. And it's much more easy to sort of like start a dialogue about how you might change a decision. And we need other people to look out for us for these decisions. So it actually turned out to be a really useful book when I was thinking about how to guide other people's decision making, because it wasn't going to be the answer that I could give them, but it's
like tools that you can use to kind of parse the world or like get around and you used a few of those words even in your description, and I'm sure you're aware, but I'll just point them out for people listening. You used the word halo effect.
Yep.
And the other one was, did you use
confirmation bias?
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, and there are way more of these than than we could possibly go through in the podcast. But let's go ahead and break those two down, because this is what the first section of the book is all about, which is learning these different sort of cognitive traps, these traps that your brain falls into.
And I'll just kind of set that up by saying like these ideas that Alex, that you're putting forward, like that's what the book is. Like each one of the chapters tends to give at least one or two vocabulary words that use, like, look at people's judgment and try to give ways to understand that. And I love also that each chapter, it sort of poses itself as a riddle.
Yeah.
So you start reading it and like, like he's trying to get the best out of the reader, or he's like, look at this situation. Like, how would you answer this question? And you're like, oh yeah, I know the answer. And then he's like, aha, so every chapter you feel a little bit stupid at the beginning, and then 4 pages later, a little smarter, because you're like, now I know, I see my faults.
Yeah. Well, and like stupid in the way that like watching a magician perform a trick makes you feel stupid, where you're like, that's impossible.
Yes.
Right. And it's not like he ever makes fun of us or he like belittles our intelligence, or like you feel stupid because like it's too hard to get. It's because he pulls a magic trick each each chapter, and you're like, well, clearly the ball like is under that cup. And then he lifts it up and he's like, nope, the ball has been in my palm the whole time, and here's why. And that's the thing that I think is so marvelous about this, is that even when you're reading this and you know you're about to have a trick pulled on you, you still fall into it. And it just reminds you that, like, even when you're watching out for yourself, it's so hard to avoid these traps and these biases and like all the stuff that's wired into the way that we think and decide that we're not as in control of as we'd like to believe.
I think that was one of the main takeaways for me, is just that we're not as in control of as we like to believe, because the more of these, I'll call them puzzles, that he puts in through the book, I just kept falling for them, so many, and you're just like, and in a way, it's this kind of experiential learning where he could just tell you, even in this podcast, we could just tell you the definitions of these words, and you might go like, oh, yeah, I get that. But there's something about going through it, reading the book, even if you were to just choose a few of the chapters, as we will in just a second, and kind of go through that, and then applying it to life and seeing them in real life, that you start to experience it and you start to feel that disconnect, that's like more palpable. So you got to use this stuff. And that for me, he uses the word mistrust. Like, you got to learn to know how to observe your shortcomings and then mistrust your intuition or something like that.
Yeah. The not trusting your intuition is a huge part of this. And it's something that I feel like we should come back to, but you started to make a point here about why the book is so good that I think is worth driving home, which is that Kahneman understands sort of how the brain works, and he takes his own advice as he writes the book, right? That, towards the end, like, he talks so much about, and this comes in the setup in the beginning as well, about how the brain just does not think statistically, intuitively. It can't think about categories of things. Like, you can't think of a category of people, but you can think of a stereotype of a person who fits that category and sort of represents that category.
What would be an example of
who is that persona? You can think of like 35-year-old secular humanists who have the latest iPhone, like only use Mac products.
Like, I can imagine what that person looks like in my head. I can make this person
right.
up.
And there is in fact a demographic that fits that, right? Yeah. But you can't think of coming up with specific examples not always gonna like.
Is this actually illustrating the point?
Well, yeah, like I was gonna say, like, if I were to articulate the category of like feminists. Yeah. It could be quite difficult because, in fact, it is quite broad, but you probably have, as soon as I said that word, some stereotype of what a feminist is that pops up into your brain.
Category,
and there's a much more nuanced conversation that needs to happen here around, like, is your stereotype correct? Is your stereotype an accurate representation of that category, or is it not? But the underlining point is that we can think of a stereotype because there's a story that we tell, right?
Yes.
That the brain is wired for stories. And so he starts each chapter and he fills each chapter with all of these stories so that he's not just telling us what the halo effect is, or what confirmation bias is. He's telling us a story that we can remember so that when we come back to this concept, it makes us feel something. That we're connected to the idea through this sort of experience of going, oh, I feel like I watched a little movie in my mind about that, or that reminds me of this person in my life who did just that thing. And so I think that's a really smart, compelling thing about the book, because, in the end of the book, he includes like 2 academic papers, which, I read and made sense, but I didn't retain in the same way that the book sticks with me, because he tells the book through stories. And
so he eats his own dog food in a way where he's just like, I know the best way to learn. I'm going to teach you that, and while I teach you that, I'm going to teach you how to learn. I don't know. There's like some kind of levels.
Yeah. Oh,
thought.
he's very, very conscious in the way that he set all of this up.
Awesome.
I mean, it's his research. He's a Nobel Prize winner. It's like out of this world sort of research to begin with.
Yeah.
But the thing that's really impressive is that he's able to take all of that and eat his own dog food and create something that the average reader can still really get into.
Yeah.
I mean, it's weighty and it's meaty. And this is not like when I read Twilight and it felt like I was doing meth and it finished it in a weekend and like I didn't really feel good afterwards, but I experienced it. Whereas like this is something that's like, wow, that was a really good meal at a wonderful restaurant. I couldn't quite finish it. I think I'm gonna come back to this place and like try it again and like keep eating it. And like it's gonna take a while to really take it all in, you know.
You have to like let it sit in your stomach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm really into eating books.
Eating metaphors?
Right? Yeah,
or eating paper? Well, you have the hardcover book, so you have a little more to eat than I do.
Yeah, for everybody out there in TV land, there's a little sidebar before the podcast started where, because I have the hardcover of the book and Chris has the soft cover, I was certain that my insights on this podcast were going to be at least $10 more impressive than his.
Right.
So you can let us know.
I think there's some biases
whether
there.
whether that actually happens. Right. And that was part of our discussion too, is like how much the wrapper of an object really starts to affect what we think about it.
And it totally does. And it's interesting. This book is interesting it reminds me of Malcolm Gladwell's Blink a little bit. Have you read that one? Okay. It's similar. And
I have not.
We talked about it on the podcast in the past because it's about intuition and it's about snap judgments you make. And Kahneman's kind of criticized Gladwell because Gladwell's whole thing is you got to trust your intuitions. And Kahneman in this book is like you have to be skeptical of your intuitions. But yes, in the Gladwell book, they talk about how they did a study with Coke cans, and one would have the Coke wrapper on it, and one would have like nothing on it. And it's called transference, the transference of the experience of just having the Coke can. People are like, oh yeah, this one's better, but they were both Coca-Cola.
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar to the studies they've done where they give you a glass of wine or they let you buy a bottle of wine, and it's the exact same wine. And when you pay more for the wine, you enjoy it more. That the story we tell ourselves about the experience is all wrapped up in it. I mean, this is why marketing works. Most of the things that we buy are arguably very similar commodities, but certain brands have done very good jobs of telling stories, and they've played upon and like very well orchestrated around this sort of manipulation of perception.
I went through a similar last week I spent $5 extra for one of those clean canteens just because it was black and all the other ones were colored. And I think I think part of reading this book and then making that decision now lets me know how absurd that is, but also that I'm still doing it because of that transference. I don't know. It was like this shiny black and all the other ones looked kind of cheap looking. And it was really just the same bottle, but it made me feel better. And I understood that decision I understand my illogicalness.
Yeah. Well, okay. And that's like right at the core of this book is that we think of ourselves as like the driver in a car, right? Yeah. We got this voice in the back of our head. We have this perception and we're going through the world and things are happening to us and we're deciding all sorts of things and like we are totally in control, right? That is what I believe about the world. That is what most people believe about the world. And that is exactly what Daniel Kahneman in this book takes issue with and then starts to explain why, well, that's not really what's going on.
Hey, Alex.
Hey, Chris.
Hey, how you doing? So, what are you drinking over there?
Oh, I'm keeping it super classy for our Nobel Prize winner with a Old Grandad Bourbon Straight and a PBR Chaser.
Oh, nice. I have an Old Grandad soaked in coffee, cold coffee. I know I gave you a little bit of that before. I don't know why no one's ever offered me this delicious drink before.
It's sort of a morning hangover drink, I think.
Oh, you've heard of this before?
No.
Oh.
But like anytime you mix booze with coffee,
Yeah.
I mean, that's why they call an Irish coffee an Irish coffee.
Got
You
it.
put
Oh,
the
it is like an
Irish
Irish
cream
coffee, yeah.
in the coffee. At least that's cream. It like
pretty
makes
good.
sense. It's supposed to go in the coffee, but it's clearly for people who either are alcoholics and they need to drink first thing in the morning, or they're trying to get over a terrible hangover by caffeinating themselves and drinking. It's the mimosa or Bloody Mary of coffees.
Cool. I think there's a third category of people that are about to go on a podcast after reading a 400-page book last night.
That's entirely possible. Well, Chris, we've talked about a couple of these terms specifically, and I did promise, and I like keeping my promises, that we would start to explain them a little bit.
Let's do that.
So one of them I want to talk about real quick is the halo effect, because I think this one is huge.
Me too.
It's really easy to see.
It's one of my favorites.
Yeah. So here's what Kahneman has to say in the chapter where he brings it up is he talks about the exaggerated emotional coherence.
Read it to me. Tell me.
Yeah.
Tell me.
And that's a bit to chew on, but he says, if you like the president's politics, you'll probably like his voice and his appearance as well. The tendency to like or dislike everything about a person, including things you have not observed, is known as the halo effect. The term's been in use in psychology for a century, but it's not come into wide use in everyday language, which is a pity because the halo effect is a good name for a common bias that plays a large role in shaping our view of people and situations. What I love about this is, he goes on to explain this in much greater detail, that if you like something and just one part of it, you'll sort of project that liking onto the rest of them. Even if you were asked to evaluate a quality independently of that one thing that you really liked, you might not like the others. But there's this, it's like a magnetism, right?
Yeah.
That like, if you're positive about someone or something or an idea, you're positive about the things around
I do this
it.
all the time. Like, not only in interviews, but like dating. Like, if a girl's into improv, I'm like pretty attracted to her. Is that the same kind of thing? And then I'm all of a sudden like, she must be awesome and funny.
Right. You start making these assumptions because like this one common point.
Yeah.
You see this all the time when like this is what name dropping is, right? Name dropping is the halo effect.
Tell me more.
Well, so a lot of people can do it like really ham-fistedly where it doesn't work, but the idea is that when you say this other person's name and they're famous or they're attractive or they're smart, suddenly you're right next to them. You're in association with them. And so you're thought of and they're thought of in association with you. And so they're like, you're caught up in their halo of awesomeness.
That's I didn't really think of it that way. That's interesting. So if you're like, I hang out with Beyonce or something like that.
You do?
Yeah. So this one time, my friend's sister was hanging out.
Chris, don't tease me.
What about if it's your friend's sister's boyfriend's?
Well,
does that count? Because I've heard a lot of people drop names like that.
No, see, I think that like entirely misses the point because that like emphasizes the distance.
Oh, interesting.
Between you and the thing that you're trying to get the halo from.
Totally.
This is what celebrity endorsements are. Right? Celebrity endorsements are just like maybe too heavy-handed with the halo effect. But when you see Jennifer Aniston like promoting a perfume or, Brad Pitt selling a whiskey, albeit in Japan and not in the American market, it's because this person does it and they're cool.
Must be good.
This must be cool too, right? The
Right.
halo effect is all around us.
Yeah, I think the tricky thing sometimes is that it's true though. Like sometimes, like maybe it is good if Brad Pitt drinks it. No, I don't know. Or
well, like so you go back to that blind taste test that you talked about earlier, right? Where like you got the Coke label versus the non-Coke label, and the experience of drinking the sugar water probably. It could be about the same. Maybe it's even worse.
Yeah.
But the perception, the thing that's happening in our mind, totally changes it for us.
I wonder if there's a benefit of marketing in that, like, because I know this has like this evil connotation of like they're using the halo effect to make me believe things that aren't true, but in a way they're saving you from making decisions which are just as paralyzing, where if you have all these decisions and you're like, what the hell should I drink? It's like, well, what is Brad Pitt drinking? And I'm just going to drink that, for example. Because I feel like, there's this new debilitation of choices that people are just unhappy and unclear. And so, God damn it, if Bill Murray was drinking whiskey, like, I'm just going to drink Suntory. You know what I mean? Like, I don't have to make any more choices. Like, he made my life easier. Thank you.
Well, I mean, you bring something up here that was one of my other huge takeaways from the book.
Oh, tell me.
Which is that, the brain gets worn out by making decisions. I don't think this is like huge revelation for most of us who like have to make a lot of decisions in a day. Like, it can be really exhausting. But that there is a physical limit to sort of the amount of decisions that you can make, and it's biological. It's not just like, oh, like, I don't want to do this anymore. Yeah. It's there was an experiment he talked about here. Yep. Let's see.
I think it's physically glucose. The idea that like I could read from the book that the idea that mental energy it's more than just a metaphor. The nervous system consumes glucose and more glucose than any other part of the body.
Yeah.
So you're literally depriving yourself of glucose. Which is why if you're low in energy, a lot of times you'll like put sugar into your body.
Yeah,
right?
and it actually makes a difference, right?
So your body physically chomps down on that shit.
Yeah, they did this experiment where you were supposed to watch something on a screen, and they were scrolling words across the bottom. They were like telling you, don't pay attention to the words, right? And it's like really hard to do. It's like not thinking of a pink elephant, right? Yep. And so like it takes effort, and it takes physical effort, and that spins the glucose. Yeah. And so after they did that, they took the two groups in the experiment out to another room and gave them a little cup of lemonade and said, all right, take a minute, breathe. We know that was sort of tiring. And we're going to have you do a little test here at the end, and you're going to figure out, you're going to solve a couple more puzzles. Now, half the lemonade had actual sugar in it, and half the lemonade had Splenda, which has no glucose. And the group that got the Splenda performed more poorly on the puzzles than the group with Splenda, because they were actually able to like you said, like, oh my God, feed my brain, like just throw some sugar on there and like start to give me more energy. Yes. And this idea that your decision-making ability could be like depleted over the day really stuck with me. And this is why we hear so many people talk about like having a dress code or trying not to make decisions or like habitualize parts of their lives.
Because with each decision you make, you're literally draining resources. Like in a video game, your heart level just went down a little bit. Yeah. And so if you wear the same blue shirt every day, point to myself. Yeah. You're like, I don't have to make that decision, and then you saved yourself some time.
Yeah, Steve Jobs wore...
A lot of genius people, like Zuck and all those people.
Obama mentioned in I think a famous article that he only has like 2 colors of suits.
Yeah, why not? Yeah.
Because you don't want to think about things that aren't important.
And that's why people get assistants too, because then your assistant can do all that kind of cognitive booking of tickets, and your cell phone died or whatever. It's like if you can offload that to somebody. This is a big point in the book, The Organized Mind. Have you read that one?
No, I haven't. But Daniel Levinstein, right?
It's brilliant. I would say it's the follow-up to this book, in that it takes all of this and kind of makes big stories out of it. And one of the stories is about having an assistant and how that like offload some of this and allows you to make fewer mistakes because you're not draining this kind of glucose in your brain and stuff like that. It's pretty fascinating.
Well, and this opens up excuse me. This opens up huge implications for conversations around privilege too, right? So like people who don't have assistance, people who don't even like have support in their job for rudimentary things, people who are dealing with extreme poverty or health issues, or like all these other things that they have to deal with in conversations around race and sexuality, like where each layer that you add to something that you have to think about through the day makes your life more difficult because you're actually spending time thinking. Whereas like two straight ass white schlubs like you and me, in fact, I don't even know what schlub means. I keep using that, but
I'll be a schlub for this purpose of this conversation.
Two guys like you and me have like the extraordinarily like wonderful privilege from our perspective of not having to think about a lot of things, which actually means our brains are using so much less energy just to get through the day compared to so many other people, right? And that like this story, this idea that like your brain just like has to use energy to deal with all of this. Like this means we're literally burning less energy than a person of color, than a woman, than a transgendered person as we go through the exact same experience. It's not just that like our culture makes it easier on us. Like we just spend less energy. It's literally like easy mode on a video game.
I wonder if that's related to actually something that I learned in Daniel Kahneman's TED Talk, which is the idea that you can be happy. They did this study in Americans, and if you make $60,000, have you heard this?
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
If you make $60,000, above $60,000, the line is just flat on your happiness. But underneath that, it's a big drop. So basically saying up until $60,000, you're less inclined to be happy. But at 60,000, there's no difference between 60, 70, 80. People don't tend to get more happy. There's like a peak or like a threshold for happiness in America. And maybe I hadn't connected the two dots, but maybe it's because, like you're saying, like poor, if your household income is less than 60,000, like you have a lot of challenges where you can't just like offload that to the laundromat or like get daycare or some of these things. You have this cognitive load, and it's very unsettling. I mean, it's like, fuck, it's like a lot of energy.
Well, so I remember when I first moved to New York, I was living out in an apartment in Crown Heights, with my partner at the time, and we would go across the street and we would grocery shop and we'd put everything in the basket and we'd stop short of the register and we'd look down and we'd start adding up how much everything cost, because we were on such a tight budget. We were like just working our first jobs in New York. We were not making much money, like under $30,000. We were, like really kind of scraping by. And there were plenty of times where we did the math and we're like, we don't literally have enough in the bank account to buy this food. Wow. So what am I going to put back? So after a day of work, after commuting, after dealing with everyone else, after going through and picking the things you want, you then got to find the energy to figure out what you're going to take away from yourself.
Which is the worst kind of loss, because we're inclined to feel more drain of energy when you lose something. So you're setting yourself up even more for failure.
Right. And so, when I think about this idea that 60,000 is like a threshold, I don't think it's like your happiness stops growing. I think there's just such a huge jump that happens from the difficulties of people who are living on minimum wage, people who are, living beneath the threshold for what a living wage is in a particular area of the world. That like when you jump up to what is easy enough that like you can take some decisions off the table just by throwing money at it, right? Yeah. That like you get to be happier, not because like this is the threshold for happiness, but because you get to take away unhappiness in a way.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, I want to thank my guest, Alex Miles Younger. Again, this is a two-part episode. So in this episode, him and we chatted mostly about cognitive biases. In the second, the follow-up coming out later this week, we will chat about System 1 and System 2 in more depth, as well as the experiencing self versus the remembering self, which is a whole section of the book called The Two Selves, which I really love, and I'm excited to chat with him more about. So that's what's coming up. I'm going to close out this episode letting you know that if you would like to subscribe on iTunes, I would like to tell you that I like that, because that is great and you're just spreading the love. Share it with some friends. Much appreciated. If you would like to get this book on Audible, you can find it at audibletrial.com/onbooks, all one word. If you go there, you will get the first month free. I set that up to share with you guys. Check it out. It also helps support the show. My name is Chris Castiglione. The episode editor for this episode is Gabrielle Urbina. Music right now is by Birdstar, and the music up front is by Taylor Bentz. It's a remix of a Knife and Joanna Newsom song that I just love. All right, so thank you, and looking forward to part 2.